Okay, so Shaman is a really weird class because it seems like it's either way too strong, like Shudderwalk Shaman, Evolve Shaman, and Galakrond Shaman, and needs immediate nerfs, or it's really, really bad like it has been for quite some time. And I feel like it's really hard to balance because of the overload mechanic and a couple of other issues, and I want to talk about them right now. And this is how I personally would buff or rework Shaman, and considering the fact that there are going to be a lot of buffs coming out, 10 buffs coming out on Tuesday, I think that talking about this is very well timed. So let's just discuss everything that I want to do with Shaman. And TLDR, I think a couple of things need to happen. One, Overload needs to be reworked and in general buffed, or there needs to be more interaction with Overload, more interaction cards like Landslide, okay? Next, I think that Shaman needs to just have more draw. I think that Shaman lacks draw right now so badly that it will run out of resources in almost any matchup, and it's very inconsistent in like its win conditions because it can't draw. 4, it needs actual win conditions other than Doomhammer, Rockbiter, Weapon, or some insanely broken thing that immediately gets nerfed, like an insane Evolve play. And 5, it needs a class identity. It needs a direction that it is going in order to know what to do with the class, right? Every single class has stuff it's known for that Blizzard has been working towards for a while, right? Mage, spells, reducing the cost of spells, burst from hand, and stuff like that. Druid, ramp. Paladin, dudes, and buffing those dudes. Warlock, basically the counter to control decks that's also ironically control. Face Hunter, need I say more? Demon Hunter, good at everything, got nerfed to the point where it really has no identity now, and I would also kind of want to rework Demon Hunter. That's a topic for another day. Rogue, tons of cool stuff. Highest skill cap class in the game with a ton of draw, good tempo, good stats, but its downside is it's hard to play. Warrior, usually control, but sometimes has an aggressive archetype with weapons. And then that leads us to Shaman, which has like nothing. Also Priest. Priest has basically become just the general control, tons of value, a lot of healing deck. With a little bit more RNG than I would like, but at least it's not as bad as it was last expansion. But Shaman is nothing. The closest thing I can find to a Shaman archetype is having to read what's going to happen in another turn, right? Having to plan turns ahead, whether it be cards like Turret, right? That say if you played a spell the previous turn, right, it costs 3 less, like it does something. Or elementals, right? That say if you played an elemental last turn, it'll do something. Or overload, you do something this turn, but you're delayed the next turn. And that's a pretty cool identity. And it requires skill to pull off, right? You have to read what your opponent's gonna do in general. But the problem is overload sucks and it's the main mechanic, and there aren't enough cards to support the other archetypes like Elemental or Spell Shaman to actually like warrant it. Right now, Spell Shaman has 2 cards. Torrent and, what is it? I forgot what it's called. The Marsh Spawn. If you cast a spell last turn, discover a spell. Elemental Shaman also has very few cards, right? You got the Cage Match Custodian, which gives you a weapon, which is kind of weird in the Elemental Shaman deck, but not unheard of. But then you have Nimbus. Like, I think Elemental Shaman is the closest to being relevant, but even so, the abilities that you get, there are a couple of things that give you abilities, like the Lilypad Lurker, and a couple of ones in the neutral area, like the Gyreworm, I don't know how to say it, I'm kind of dumb. And I feel like that is not good. I feel like Elemental Shaman needs a bit more of a push, and I feel like if they focus on Elemental Shaman for a little bit, to give them that identity, it would help Shaman as a whole. Because right now it has a lot of elementals, but they all rely on like weird different things, right? 2 of the elementals, I realize now that Shattered Rumbler also requires a spell to be cast last turn. Some of these cards require a spell to be cast last turn, like this one and like I said, the Marsh Spawn. And other ones require Overload to happen, and other ones require an elemental to be played the previous turn. There's just too much going on, and they need to focus on just one of them. Have it focus more on interacting with other minions being played, other spells being played, or elementals being played, or overload. Or point is one of those 3 things. You can't have it have a deck where you need to have constantly everything going on the previous turn to make it relevant. Other cards that interact with Overload, or other things just in general, are cards like Landslide, which you would probably put in Elemental Shaman, and again, you'd need Overload to make this actually good, which means that if you spent the last turn playing an Elemental to get another synergy, or have the potential to get another synergy, Landslide is just bad. The point is, Shaman's all over the place, and because of that, it's very hard to balance because it has no identity. The next thing I want to talk about is Overload just as a whole. I think Overload is really stupid, but I also really like it. I think Overload is a really interesting mechanic that gives you an immediate reward, but a delayed consequence. And like I said, it's like Shaman's thing of planning a turn ahead. The problem with Overload is that it's almost never worth it. If you look at Novice Zapper and compare it to the Mage's Lab Partner, I'm going to choose Lab Partner basically every time. Because even though I get slightly less tempo, most of the time I'm using it for the spell damage, and Lab Partner is better. Like, if both of them were neutral, I would say Lab Partner is my pick almost every single time. Next, we look at a card like, where's Shaman? Next, we look at a card like Feral Spirits, and you're like, okay, Feral Spirits has seen, like, no play for the past 4 or 5 years. Okay, that might not be true, a little bit of an exaggeration, but you get the point. And if you compare it to other cards in classes, these cards are about similar power levels, but also see next to no play. So they're better than Feral Spirits, but so bad that they're still not even played in any of their specific classes. Vile Call, 3 mana summon 2/2/2 demons with Lifesteal. Lifesteal is potentially better than Taunt in some situations, especially with this meta being very focused on like burst from hand. And Druid has a 3 mana 2/2 Treants, and Treants have synergy with other cards. Obviously, that's more of the case in Wild right now, but there has been Treant-based Druid metas. It revolves around something that Druid can build around. Shaman's is just 3 mana 2/3 Taunt, Overload 1. I feel like this card should be a 2/4, 2/4 minions. And you might be wondering, why would it be 2/4s? Well, you have to think about this, right? Is there a world where this card could exist without Overload? And if so, and if you could compare it to that, what are the power levels comparatively? And the closest card you can compare this to is Barricade, a summon 2/4 guards with Taunt for 4 mana. And you could say that it is worse than Feral Spirits because technically you need no minions to be on your board. But I feel like that's not even as bad. Like, it's a condition, but it's not that bad of a condition. Shaman, you have to significantly limit your following turn, your turn 4, which is a very powerful turn for most classes, for weaker stats than what you get out of the Warrior card. Whereas the Warrior card, you're putting it specifically in a deck that revolves around no minions, and will always get that value. And because of that, I feel like Feral Spirits should be buffed to a 2/3. Obviously, I'm not saying that it should be. I'm just saying that the power level of Overload cards needs to be increased. Lightning Storm being overloaded 2 hinders you so much the next turn that playing it, even though it wipes your board and will save you, leaves you so vulnerable the next turn that by the time you're able to play anything again, you're basically in the same spot you just were in. And then obviously Serpentine Portal, that is a pretty viable card, but then you have other cards that are just hard to balance, like Earth Elemental, which is just not good. But there are a couple of well-balanced overloaded cards like Totem Shaman, Serpentine Portal, like I said. I think Runic Carvings is okay, and Mistrunner. I think that all those are relatively well-balanced overloaded cards. And then the other thing is, if you don't want to buff the overload itself, give Shaman more cards like Landslide. Give you a benefit for being overloaded, or specific cards that say this card can use overloaded mana crystals. Something that has a unique interaction with overload, and have that be the focus of Shaman, right? Rather than it being like, oh, we need a spell overload elemental Shaman deck with damage potentially late game for our win condition, because we really don't have one either. As opposed to revolving mostly around overload, or mostly around elementals, or mostly around like spell-based stuff. And right now, Shaman doesn't really have any of that. And I think that more cards like Landslide would be really interesting. There used to be a card that was a 1/3 elemental excuse me, for 1, that was if you were overloaded, your attack goes to 2. Rather than just being a 1-3, it becomes a 2-3 if you're overloaded. And more cards like that to increase tempo, to give you benefit for being overloaded, so overload isn't just a downside for some admittedly low-statted cards considering what they are supposed to do, and the fact that you're limited so hard the following turn. And then the last thing Shaman needs, in my opinion, for the most part, is just draw. If you go through all of this and you go to draw, Shaman has a couple of cards, right? But if you look at other classes, Demon Hunter, tons. Druid, tons. Hunter, very few, but that is Hunter's identity, to be fair. Hunter's identity is high risk, tons of damage for high reward. That is the specific identity of Hunter, so Hunter gets a pass. Mage, more than a page. Paladin. Paladin is similar to Hunter. Its identity is resource generation, or is dudes and buffing minions with a little bit of draw. But you also have to take into consideration that there are cards like the sword that thin out your deck as well, that are not draw cards, but they're basically draw cards. And then obviously as you go down the list, you go to Priest, which actually doesn't have that much draw, but like I said, is more of an RNG class. Rogue, tons of draw. Warlock, tons of draw and hero power. Warrior, tons of draw. And then you have Shaman, which really has very few draw options. Basically, all of these are, well, one okay minion and the other 2 are garbage. And like a couple of discover cards, right? You do have a couple of other discover cards. Primordial Studies, Fireheart, the Marsh Spawn, which again we talked about, really is weird because it needs a specific condition to be met, and Guidance, which is actually a pretty good card. I like Guidance quite a bit, actually. But again, you look at Shaman, and it seems to be way behind everything else in terms of just draw in general, and because of that, it's going to fall behind every deck and almost every matchup. And I feel like that just needs to change. I think if with a little bit more draw, there would be more control archetypes, right? It would be easier to pull off the control decks because you're going to more reliably keep up with other control decks and draw enough to have enough resources to deal with constant threats from aggro decks. And with 2 of the cards being absolute dog water, it really only has 1 draw card in the entire class, and it's so bad. So Manatide Totem needs to be buffed, and there should be cards that give you more draw. Like, there are a lot of things that say draw 2. Like, if we specifically say draw 2 and press enter, Demon Hunter has a couple, Druid has a couple, Guess the Weight potentially draws 2, Mage has a couple, Priest has this one, I guess, Rogue has a couple, and so does Warrior with Cutting Class. Warlock has hero power and free admission. Backfire is 3, and Warrior is again 2. Most of the classes, except Hunter and Paladin, which you said it's part of their identity to not draw, and Shaman, which doesn't have an identity, those are the only classes without a draw 2 card. So my proposal is a draw 2 card for Shaman that says if you are overloaded, draw 2. If you're not, draw 1. That would be a great way to incorporate all the things that I think Shaman should do. It is a spell card to help certain archetypes that interacts with Overload, which helps certain archetypes, and addresses the lack of draw in Shaman. It basically does everything we need to do for Shaman, and it helps out quite a bit. And I feel like that, along with maybe one other card, like a good minion that can get tempo if you're overloaded, or a minion that's like a 3-mana 3/4 if you're overloaded, draw a card or something like that, similar to how Paladin has their 3-mana 3/4 that draws a card if you have a minion out or a secret out on the board. I feel like those 2 cards with decent stats and efficient draw, if you have conditions met, would be really good overall for the class. I hope you guys enjoyed my TED Talk. Not really a TED Talk, my rant though. And I hope you guys, if you enjoy this, put this on Reddit or something. I feel like a lot of these changes are pretty interesting, and I feel like it would help the Shaman class a lot. And I feel like the stuff I said at the beginning matters a little bit less than what I said it happens, or that I said at the end, but all of it's still relevant. It really just needs identity. It really needs draw. It needs more focus. It needs better stats. Overload needs to be nerfed. And the other thing I want to say, one last thing, is this example right here. If there's anything I want to leave you with, let it be this. This card right here. Hammer of Naru, if it was printed in Shaman right now, it would probably be a 6-mana 3/3 Battlecry. Summon a 6/6 Elemental with Taunt, Overload 2. And obviously it's in Paladin without Overload, but when you look at this card and look at this text, this is very believable. And this just goes to show that they just slap Overload on stuff, or the power level of stuff is so high at this point that like Overload shouldn't even be a mechanic anymore because it's going to be outpaced by everything anyway. But yeah, if you're going to be left with anything, be left with this. This is a realistic card that you could believe exists in Hearthstone, and it is strictly 2 mana worse than a card that already exists. And that just goes to show how problematic or how much of a hole Shaman is in right now. Again, hope you guys enjoyed my TED Talk. I'll see you next week.